All right, Ben, welcome
Good.
to the podcast. Really excited for us to connect and have this conversation. We've been able to talk offline, and I've really enjoyed talking to you briefly and trying to getting a feel for how you see the world. It's always interesting, um, the journeys we all take, and I'm hoping to learn about yours a bit more. It's based on what you've shared. It sounds very intriguing. So over to you if you don't mind introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about who you are and what's brought you here.
Sure. And thank you for bringing me on, Furkhan. I'm Ben Oofana, and my background starts, I'll make it as condensed as possible, from a very early age, maybe 3, 4. In those days, our parents using the television set as the babysitter sat us in front of the TV set to keep us occupied. And so seeing the native people getting massacred in those cowboy and Indian movies was quite upsetting to me, and I'd be
Mhm.
screaming and throwing fits. And conversely, when the natives were winning, I was like, "Get them!" And but
Mhm.
that fascination, that pull to Native Americans, continued to increase as I grew into adolescence, and I started hearing about the traditional Native American doctors, medicine men and women, and their practices, and it was very powerful visionary experiences that they would have. And even at 14, I was thinking to myself, well, if ever given the opportunity, this is what I'll do with my life.
Mhm.
And by the time I was 17, I'd taken off on my own, landed in a community in southwestern Oklahoma. It was predominantly Kiowa Indians, and started going into the ceremonies with native elders. And they made an exception to allow me in, the fact
Mhm.
that I was non native.
Mhm.
And And it was in the peyote meetings that I met my mentor, Horace Dolkai, who was one of the last surviving traditional doctors or medicine men among the Kiowa tribe. And Horace, as I began to apprentice with him, he would transmit portions of his own healing gifts to me. And then, in order to earn the right to work with these gifts of healing, you go through the vision quest, which typically entails going out to fast alone in the mountains 4 days and nights, no food and no water,
Mhm.
which I've gone many, many
Mhm.
times over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And
Sure.
what have you been able to experience through some of those fasting excursions, if I may call them? But yeah, like I think I, it's interesting because I've spoken to a lot of people that do these retreats, and they can be very profound and
Hmm.
can bring up a lot, sometimes a lot of discomfort, a lot of truth
Hmm.
that we tend to suppress. But yeah, I'm always interested to hear everyone's experience around that.
For me, the greatest discomfort is not having water. I could deal with everything else much more easily.
Hmm.
And I think because of my nature orientation, in my mid 20s, when the traumas of my childhood and adolescence started resurfacing, and as I was trying to form some kind of relationship, romantic attachments, and the emotion that would come up would be so excruciatingly painful when those relationships were not working, when my desire to be with someone was going unreciprocated. And and instinctively I taught myself to dive into the depth of the pain, and I would just continue to breathe very softly and deeply. Now, it'd be excruciating, and yet I would just keep breathing into the pain. But at a certain point, it would break open. I'd feel the pain coming out of my body in waves and these emanations of warmth glowing from within. So that orientation that I developed, and I've continually taught myself over the years, if something's painful or distressing, instead of running from it or avoiding from it, just go right into the middle of it.
Hmm.
And now I know a lot of people not doing that the tendency for much of the population, don't go
Mhm.
there, don't look at that, don't acknowledge it, suppress those feelings, self-medicate with food or alcohol or
Mhm.
pharmaceuticals or whatever, whatever distraction they find.
Mhm.
If you go on a vision quest in that case, then what comes up can be much more uncomfortable emotionally. Maybe for some it could be a bit terrifying, but for me, there are times when I'm on the mountain where I have had traumatic events from my past come up. In many instances, events, occurrences that I had completely forgotten about, no
Mhm.
recollection of, or even if I did have a recollection, maybe the memories were to some degree faded. But all this would be coming back up with this power and intensity.
Mhm.
I would be experiencing those events again, and they would be incredibly vivid. All the sensory impressions of physical sensations, and
Mhm.
hearing what I heard, seeing what I saw, and experiencing the emotions. And I think in some instances, the emotions were actually more acute because a lot of times when we go through some horribly stressful or traumatic event, we're in some degree of a state of shock. It just doesn't fully register with us what's
Mhm.
happening. We're a bit numbed. We may even be somewhat dissociated, but
Yeah.
we just don't fully register. So I'd be on the mountain and this is all coming out. But for me, I would stay with it and I could feel this extraordinarily powerful presence descending into my body while I'm on the mountain, and this other forces or beings or whatever they may be,
Yeah.
they're working with me to chew up and digest this whole experience to transform it. And so what had previously been a trauma, as it's
Mhm.
digested, it becomes fuel for growth.
Mhm.
And and I find it that it would be building this foundation that I didn't have before. Like we all
Mhm.
have these internal models or structures of sorts, but in many instances, and I see this working with people as I look into their bodies and minds, and I see and I feel the trauma. For instance, what they refer to as chakras or in the aura, all that. When I
Yeah.
look, oftentimes there's a lot of damage there. It's like either they fail to develop, and you see people who are very much dissociated, not present in their bodies, or they can be very damaged and disfigured. And and I see people carry that, this wounding throughout their
Mhm.
lives. And I am so grateful, despite the fact that the vision quest can be extraordinarily uncomfortable
Yeah.
without the food and water, and you're there in the elements. And when I was there in October, it went to 92 degrees, and like you don't have water, and it's 92 degrees, and there's hardly any shade. I'm getting all sunburned and everything. Other times I've been buried under like 8 inches of snow. So
Mhm.
despite the discomfort, just the opportunity to heal these traumas that so many people carry throughout their lives. And so that's a big part of the experience. There's also, as I said, there are times I feel this presence or this force, these beings coming to me. So the
Mhm.
Native Americans and other indigenous peoples did not have access to the modern medical interventions, and nobody did.
Yeah.
When we go
Mhm.
back over 100 and more years ago, for thousands of years, it just wasn't available.
Mhm.
In the European cultures, that was, I think, there's a bit of it in the Eastern European countries. There's more of a esoteric traditions. But when Christianity began to spread from uh, throughout Europe, and there was tremendous persecution of
Hmm.
those what were referred to as pagan traditions. And so much of the esoteric traditions all throughout Europe, the British Isles, everything were just obliterated,
Hmm.
whereas they survived a little more in other, further in Eastern Europe. But what I would find is that as I'd work with people after coming off the vision quest, is they would describe a certain presence or force working with them.
Hmm.
And without me telling them about my experiences on the mountain, and yet what they described would in many ways match that presence that I encountered when I was on the
Hmm.
mountain.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. And as you were sharing that, what came to mind is a lot of the readings I've done, whether it's Joseph Campbell's work or
Hmm.
Carl Jung's work, where they talk about the mythological experiences and they try to obviously categorize it. And there's that whole concept of going into the underworld and
Hmm.
coming back from the abyss. And there's something to be said about that. But, a lot of the times when you're sharing that experience with other people, many people would wonder, why are you doing that to yourself? Right? Like, why put yourself in those conditions, like you said, without water or being buried in snow? So it's just, when you kind of talk to people in society, they're always like, well, why are you doing that? So I guess just
Hmm.
why? If the person is wondering, right? Like if the listener is wondering, why is Ben doing this to himself?
Is he crazy?
Yeah,
what
yeah,
what
yeah,
would possess him to do such a thing?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy you're asking me these questions because, see, in our mainstream modern day world, our dominant society, there's just no point of reference. I guess
Hmm.
you do have some extreme athletes, triathlon, uh,
Yeah,
ninja, whatever. They go through all
yeah.
these.
Pushing yourself to that limit, right? I suppose physically and
Mhm.
mentally.
Yeah, Navy SEALs and some of the other elite forces go through these extremes.
Hmm.
And they're these elite warriors. And yet sometimes they end up getting killed too.
Hmm.
They're not invincible. But that's the closest thing that we have in our modern day world dominant society that most people understand. So a lot of it has to do with in these various cultures throughout the world, there's whole different understandings and there's different realms of experience that are not readily available, if available at all,
Yeah.
in our present day, modern day world. You can find it if you make a very concerted effort to seek it out. May have to go quite a distance, but you can find some of these things. But say if you have people for hundreds and hundreds of years in, say, Northern Europe or Middle America, hasn't been around for that long, but it was prevalent among Native Americans for centuries. But the native culture was, you had the largest percentage of them died out as a result of diseases, the
Hmm.
smallpox, cholera, measles, and such. And then the United States systematically sent its armies in as well and was massacring different Native groups. But so among Native Americans, there is this understanding, partly because they lived so close to the forces of nature. And and they gained this insight because of one, these people were very intuitive. They weren't so overstimulated. They're close to
Yeah.
nature, and they're seeking. And somehow, maybe some of them being open, they received this guidance, and
Mhm.
so these practices developed over centuries. And so, for instance, like I said, the vision quest, you would go out the 4 days and nights without food and water. The sun dance, you also fast without food and water. And there are a lot of differences in the tribes as far as the rituals go. But there's the understanding that they said in order to receive something good, you need to be willing to make a sacrifice. And so by going without the food and water, enduring these aesthetic, is that the right word, practices?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. In India, for instance, there's what they refer to as the aestheticism. Am I saying it right? Some of
Aestheticism. Yeah.
the sadhus, yogis would sometimes subject themselves to rather severe, what's the word, austerities.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, just intensive, very elaborate, sophisticated internal meditation practices.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add a little more context, I've also trained extensively with a master from China for 17 years. There's a lot of exchange between India, Tibet, China, all through this region, all through here and beyond. And so in these cultures, you do intensive practice, hours of intensive daily practice to develop one's body and mind. But back to Native Americans again. So in making the sacrifice, you put yourself out there on the mountain, for instance. You're up there the 4 days and nights. You're not eating, you're not drinking, you're exposed to the elements. You're quite uncomfortable at times, and you're having these
Yeah.
visionary experiences. And within their own framework, within their own understanding, there's these other forces. As I said before, Native Americans living in the wild, not having access to the modern medical interventions, and yet you had people who, somebody at some point is going to break a bone or multiple
Yeah.
bones. There's warfare. You had times where someone had a wound from getting shot by an arrow. Later on, it was bullets. And other illness, and Native people wanting solutions, needing to find workable solutions, or very, what's the word, ingenuous? Yeah, and they were determined, like, okay, we got to find a solution to this. And being close to nature, opening themselves to this other presence, other intelligence, and there was this guidance that led them to develop these practices, the vision quest, the sun dance, other intensive ritual practices. And many of them going through these practices would develop various gifts, various capabilities as far as a healer. And it wasn't like it's not that it was all the same thing. You had these different traditional doctors that some of them had the capacity to possess a specific kind of gift or healing power to, say, work with digestive issues, others neurological. And these native doctors were known throughout their own tribe and often through other tribes that they were allied with for their specific areas of expertise, those areas in which they were gifted. And so one would choose the traditional doctor that one would seek out according to what their areas of specialization were. Yeah. So again, is, as I said, the understanding among Native Americans that one needed to make the sacrifice in order to receive these gifts.
Yeah, and there's wisdom in that, and there is something about the whole aspect of making a sacrifice. You see it even in a lot of the religions. If we were to look at it, the monotheistic religions, there's the whole concept of making a sacrifice, which the whole concept is built on. We can get into that. I am curious though, because you did mention when you joined the Native Americans and they had to make an exception. One of the things I've observed is they're very protective of their traditions for obvious reasons. I can
Obviously.
appreciate why, but at the same time, they also um, do welcome or share if people are truly open to understanding. But I'm just curious around your experience of showing that interest, and then to your point, them making an exception of letting you in and trusting you as someone who can come in and absorb that wisdom. What was that like, and what did you have to demonstrate for them to feel that sense of comfort and trust with you?
I've had a very mixed experience. Not everyone was open and accepting, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
give a little detail on that. As I said, to a large extent, the culture has, first, there's the majority of the population was decimated, largely due to
Mm-hmm.
disease. And then the survivors were taken and forced onto reservations. The vast majority of their lands were taken away. And so they
Mm-hmm.
were basically put in what amounted to prison
Mm-hmm.
camp-like situations. It wasn't always quite that bad, but in many
Right.
instances, yes. And the children were taken and put in boarding schools. And many of these children, while they were held in these boarding schools, they had their traditional clothes taken away, their hair was cut short, they were beaten for speaking their native
Mm-hmm.
languages, they were shamed for their tribal culture and identity, mannerisms.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, there was also, and this is part of it, the verbal, the emotional abuse, and
Yeah.
sadly, there was also physical and even sexual abuse. And
Yes.
there, I know, Furkhan, you're up there in Canada. It from what I've heard, it was even more incidences where they're finding like all these graves of children who died in these
Yes, I've
residential
covered.
homes.
Yeah, I
What?
did a full episode on residential schools on this podcast. I actually know an individual who uh, I'm friends with who grew up in a residential school, so
Mhm.
he was gracious enough to share his experience on a full episode that I did. And this, yes, so I released this episode, and then a couple of months later, they found a whole bunch of these graves that,
Mhm.
and he'd mentioned that because there were some numbers that had come out around how many children they were uh, admitting to, at least, that had died in these schools. But his point
Mhm.
was a lot of children had died that they weren't even accounted for. Some of them had
Mhm.
died trying to run away from the schools and were frozen to
Yeah.
death, and that didn't even factor into the numbers. And just another fact, because I think it's horrible, but the last residential school to close in Canada was in 1996. So
Wow.
not too long ago, just for people that are curious. But yeah, I did cover that. And you are right there. There's all kinds of abuse to wipe out basically the tradition in a way, right?
Yeah, it's an aspect. I think the term is structural genocide,
Mm-hmm.
where this concerted effort to destroy the culture. And
Yeah.
maybe not all of it was with the intent to destroy the culture, but that was a significant influence there. So there's like generational trauma, multiple generations of
Mm-hmm.
Native Americans, of all these indigenous groups of people around the world. Native Americans have experienced some of the worst. I know Australian Aborigines too. Have to
Mm-hmm.
admit, I also feel deeply for the Ukrainians because it's going over 100 years now, the horrific brutality they've experienced at the hands of Russia. even starting from the revolution 1917. But anyway,
Mhm.
back on track here.
Yeah.
So there's the trauma that Native Americans have experienced over centuries, from the disease, the warfare, their children being put in schools. So understandably, there's a lot of wounding, trauma,
Mhm.
collective trauma passed down. There's being lied to, cheated, taken advantage of. The treaties were basically worthless. Even after they were breaking the treaties about as quickly as they were made. And and then, for years and years, Native Americans were not looked upon favorably. But all of a
Mhm.
sudden, as of the 1960s, there started to be this romanticization. I'm massacring words today. Maybe I need more
Of course.
sleep. But anyway, uh, so, and it's around the same time that you had these Indian, East Indian gurus, yogis, whatever, Tibetan lamas wandering over into through Europe and United States and Canada and everything. Uh, but people started romanticizing Native Americans, and their spirituality sort of caught on. But an unfortunate thing is that you had these individuals who would, one example, there is, and I don't mean to offend anyone, but I'm just
Mhm.
going to just be straightforward with it.
Yeah.
Soul retrieval, for instance. And you have these individuals who, I guess the founder supposedly spent time with indigenous people, Michael Hardner, and concocts this ritual, and you have these people, whacking on tom-toms and supposedly calling the lost parts of your soul back or something. But I see this, and to me, it's very disheartening because it doesn't, to me, resemble in any way actual native practice. And
Mhm.
you can't just take someone. I mean, you have so many of these, and I'm Caucasian by birth, obviously, but you have these people who've grown up in our dominant culture. I'll just go ahead and say it, white folks especially are
Yeah.
the most notorious for it, and never have spent significant amounts of time with Native Americans or other indigenous groups of people, but they go through a few workshops, and now all of a sudden they're calling themselves a shaman. And are you okay if I use a little language here?
By all means.
It's absolute bullshit.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just, it so bastardizes, this,
Mhm.
it's, and I could understand when you have Native people who, there are these traditions that go back hundreds and thousands of years,
Mhm.
and they were so much a part of the soul of these people, and you have these individuals who come in and just make up garbage, nonsense,
Mhm.
bullshit, and they call it
Yeah.
native spirituality, and it's sickening to me. And so I
Mhm.
could understand why a lot of native people would be protective.
Of course.
Now, Tibetan Buddhists, for instance, they have allowed outsiders to come into their spiritual traditions. And yet the Tibetans are able to hold the reins. They call the shots, they set the
Yeah.
terms. So they are able to maintain the integrity of their tradition. It's like you don't just go off and do whatever stupid ass crazy shit and call yourself a lama.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they can, as I said, maintain the integrity. And yet
Mhm.
here Native Americans are dealing with this massive collective trauma. There's also the struggle with alcoholism, and part of that has to do with, whereas Europeans and other groups, alcohol has been a part of the country for thousands of years.
Mhm.
And so genetically, our bodies have modified
Mm-hmm.
in ways that make us a little more, not everybody, but a little more resistant to where
Yeah.
Native Americans and other indigenous groups, when you don't have that genetic makeup, you're far
Mm-hmm.
more susceptible to alcoholism. And also with this mass collective, the trauma and also the individual traumas, those who carry this traumatic wounding, any of us who do for that matter, are far
Yeah.
more susceptible to developing chemical dependencies of one form or another. But in any case, so native practices have, in many respects, been bastardized. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's when native people have opened themselves and revealed their practices, and they were persecuted as well, even when they forced them onto the reservations, and
Yeah.
they were planning to conduct a Sundance, and they were told, well, if you do, we'll send the troops in and we're going to kill a whole bunch more of you. And so they had to go underground. So I believe Native people are doing the best they can to preserve what they have left. And it's challenging. It's very tough. It's difficult to even hold on to these traditions as well,
Mm-hmm.
because just the seductive pull of modern day life. And
Yeah.
you see this in many indigenous groups of people. They just, it's like, oh, television, or, you know, cars and
Yeah.
uh, smartphones, all this technology and all these, like, you know, tech trinkets, you know, that
Yeah.
people get sucked into.
Right.
And so people get drawn away. And
Mm-hmm.
the native spiritual practices, as you've heard from what I've described before, it involves a lot of extraordinary hard work. And very few people in this day and age are this disciplined.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even to get people to just do a daily meditation practice is quite a feat sometimes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, before we jumped on this recording, we were talking about asceticism, and it does require a lot of discipline, like you said. And I think one of the things I've come to appreciate is the stimulation we have all around us. So you were touching on technology or smartphones. We don't tend to disconnect now, and a lot
Mhm.
of these practices require that, right?
Yeah.
And I think, especially in today's world where we are to now, it's even more crucial to have some of those practices in place so we can just again be more present with ourselves and perhaps have some of those experiences or that wisdom that we all have within us to be able to at least hear that wisdom. And that's part of the challenge. The other piece I see, because I see it even in my social circles, because we've somehow lost a sense of culture and tradition. A lot of people will just try to navigate and just attach themselves to whatever they can to have this sense of belonging, right? I
Mhm.
know so many people that go to sweat lodges and they just feel like now they belong to something because they were able to have that community experience.
Mhm.
And I see that more in the West because, again, with globalization, there's not one sense of culture or tradition. And I can appreciate why some of the indigenous cultures, or even some of the, we'll get into it a little bit, but you were talking about the Tibetans and perhaps even in India, they tend to preserve those cultures and protect them because, like you said, they do seem to get bastardized and mixed, and people will try to put their own spin on it.
Mhm.
The other thing I've come to appreciate just talking to many, many people, including yourself and others, and understanding some of their own, whether it's religious practices or spiritual practices, there is a lot of commonality. But I'm curious because I appreciate that you've traveled quite a bit and you've seen different cultures and different experiences. What are your thoughts around that in terms of, often we will tend to otherize or have this experience of polarization that, oh, these people are different or these are others. But at the end of the day, when I look at the root of it all, it's coming from the same place.
Wow. I'm just taking in what you're saying and
Yeah.
processing it a bit.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time overseas in
Mm-hmm.
different countries. I thrive on diversity. I get bored shitless if I stay among just one group of people. There's a vast wealth through these native traditions that I've had the opportunity to deep dive in. And yet, as much power and wealth and beauty as there is, and sadly, there's so much of it that's evaporated because there's very few people practicing on this level.
Mm-hmm.
So much of it is lost. But the fact that I go through the vision quest, but even beyond what's there are ways in which every culture, every societal context has its limitations.
Mm-hmm.
We grasp a certain range of the realm of human possibility or human experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have friends that are Native American, obviously, and that I care very much for, that I'm close to. And yet at the same time, I feel like my interaction with them, I could only relate or engage with certain parts of myself. But then having spent time in different parts of the world, being in some of the different countries, Argentina, being in different parts of Europe, in China. I've, again, trained for 17 years with the master from China, stayed in China for a while, training with an older master in China who has since passed on, and a lot more time in India, but a lot more in Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just this vast wealth of experience in these, and there's both culturally, and there's just whole different ways of relating, bonding, seeing and experiencing the world. For me, like, well, dating, for instance, as I moved out of the native culture, the reason I left was because the communities that I lived in, there's a very destructive element with the drinking.
Mm-hmm.
A number of my peers that I went to school with were dying in car crashes or choking on their vomit when they got drunk. And it was heartrending for me. It was a very painful experience. I loved a lot of these people. And just seeing what was happening, it was just overwhelming. And even my mentor, seeing him go through a very destructive phase at that time. So that kind of spun me out of there. In a sense, I ended up back in the dominant culture. But I had difficulty relating in many respects. People couldn't comprehend the kinds of experiences I had where I had come from or what I had experienced. I just did the best I could, but intuitively I had this feeling like, get on a plane, go to Sri Lanka. And I did.
Yeah.
The country was in the midst of a brutal war between the government side and the LTTE, Liberation Tamil Tiger Elam, or otherwise known as the Tamil Tigers.
Yeah.
And so here I get into Sri Lanka, and they're like soldiers behind sandbag barricades and machine guns. It was heavily armed and it was tense and it was very lawless. There were all kinds of like incredibly dangerous people running around. I mean, like murderers running around free. People, lots of people who should have gotten locked up. And, but despite the dangers, and I literally had to fight my way out of a few encounters, I made myself at home in Sri Lanka, and I was living out in villages for periods of time and just totally went native. And they have their own, I mean, there's a combination. You have the majority Sinhalese are primarily Buddhist. There's a certain percentage of the Sinhalese and Tamil that have converted to Christianity. There's the Muslim population. Tamils are primarily Hindu. And there's also this very ancient indigenous practice, these people they refer to as Kapa Mahata. And they have a number of them, these paranormal abilities. Like I spent time with one, and he's like physically balancing himself on the blade of a sword that was like extraordinarily sharp. I mean, I could feel it, with my thumb. It's like, ooh, that could slice right through you. But by being with people of these different traditions in Sri Lanka, training with this master from China, a lot of the practices from the Taoist traditions, these internal Qigong practices. The thing I like about Taoism, now some of it does get very religious, which I don't care for as much, but there's a lot of it that's very humanistic, and you do the practices and you develop your body and mind. And there's also aspects of the yogic discipline that you don't necessarily have to buy into the spiritual so much, but you can do the practice and you could develop certain faculties or gifts or capabilities when you do these practices. And so I'd be doing hours of intensive Qigong practice. And so that there's so much wealth in these traditions, and I'm always, even from the time I was an adolescent, I was looking around, I see all these people, they get up in the morning and they get themselves ready, they go to school, they go to work, they come home in the evening, sit in front of the TV, or now they're scrolling on their phones or on social media, whatever, and are swiping on their apps. And I just felt that was so limiting. To me, it's not much of a life. And I felt that there's got to be more than this. And so when we have the opportunity to step into these other cultures and this wealth of experiences, knowledge that, and most people in these other cultures don't explore a lot of these practices, but there's a lot of it that's still there for those of us who desire it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, try to bring it full circle, I suppose, because I think about it more now than ever, but just want to get your thoughts on it. What's the meaning of all of this, right? Like, why are we here? I'm just curious to always understand how people perceive it. And again, just kind of reflecting on your own experience, knowing that you've traveled a huge portion of the world, you've seen some of these different practices and different wisdom around. How do people make meaning of it, and what have you been able to internalize it for yourself? Why are we here?
I don't know if I could answer that for, globally, for everyone and everything here on the planet, but I could answer it for myself. And I feel that as I look around, I see people who, for many of us, there's this emotional wounding of one form or another. And there are all kinds of influences that I feel are unhealthy that can have a numbing, deadening, disconnecting effect, that I feel every one of us has this core being that
Mhm.
resides within us, and that there's a connection to the higher power. And it doesn't matter what race or culture you come from or what religious background. I feel that is universal within each one of us. But I don't feel that most people really know or understand or comprehend this. I feel it exists, and yet I feel to a large extent it gets covered over, buried, or obscured. We have all kinds of influence, familial influences, the expectations that we're born into a family, and spending a lot of time in South Asia, and there's a kind of narcissism that's very prevalent.
Mhm.
For example, like a young man or young woman is growing up, and the parents do not necessarily recognize their own child as a separate, distinct entity with their own wants, needs, desires, their own
Mhm.
individual purpose or path in life. And so it's like, no, we don't care that you have feelings for that individual. We've selected your partner. This is who you're going to marry. Now
Mhm.
that's decreasing, but it's still prevalent. And
Mhm.
having a lot of friends through India and Sri Lanka, and they open to me and they express that the pain and the suffering they've gone through. Another example of that is just, you're going to study medicine, you're going
Mhm.
to study engineering.
Yeah.
And again, that is a form of narcissism. It's
Mhm.
fucked up.
Yeah.
And I've known individuals who have gone all the way through medical school, and I look in their bodies and I see the damage it's doing because they have so denied parts of themselves. Now, we have many different cultures, societies, cultural, societal contexts around the world, and it varies a lot wherever you go. Here in the United States, for instance, yes, there's a whole different metrics for, and some of it overlaps, but metrics for success. And so a lot of our sense of identity is wrapped up in our successes, whether it's in the professional realm, our career. We're told what our relationships should be. And
Mhm.
so if things do not go according to plan, if we have difficulty finding a partner, or if we partner with someone, which the fact that we're all vulnerable, we're all naive to varying degrees, and we get into the dating pool, and you have a lot of people who are very wounded. I think
Mhm.
something like somewhere around 15% of the people fall into what you would define as cluster B personality disorders, borderline narcissism.
Mhm.
And you get involved with someone who's a malignant narcissist, for instance, and they can just eat you from within. They could be horribly damaging. And then you have the percentage of people who are, you know, chemically dependent on alcohol and other recreational drugs. So there's all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
If our relationships are not working, then there's the emotional wounding from that. But
Right.
so we have these external criteria through which we define ourselves and we measure our success and whether our lives are worthwhile or good or not. But I feel what's important is that we take whatever has happened in our life and we work with these experiences. Like, I've gone through some pretty rough things. And
Mhm.
so my mindset is that, okay, you take whatever's happening and you utilize it as a means to heal, to
Mhm.
transform yourself, to evolve.
Mhm.
And and the more that we take the steps to heal, I do practice on a daily basis. One practice is I acknowledge what's happening, notice what I feel in my body. Furkhan, I was listening to one of your previous broadcasts talking about emotional intelligence. So this is a
Hmm.
crucial part of the process. Acknowledge
Yeah.
what's happening. What do you feel in your body? What are the feelings? Where are they situated in your body?
Hmm.
Immerse yourself in those feelings fully. You're not
Hmm.
observing them from a distance. You are fully immersed in the feelings, and you breathe softly and deeply and follow those feelings and sensations. They will go through a progression. Sometimes they'll intensify. Maybe it starts with one feeling, then it changes to another feeling. Whatever the feelings are, allow them, be fully present. You work with this process, and what it does is it enables you to chew up, and this important word, digest. You
Hmm.
digest your life experiences, you digest your subsequent cognitive and your emotional responses. As you thoroughly digest your lived experiences and your subsequent cognitive and emotional responses, you transform these experiences. They become fuel for
Hmm.
growth.
Yeah.
And at the same time, see, much of the population not knowing how to deal with their emotions,
Hmm.
they internalize the stress. They lose a job, relationship blows up.
Yeah.
Yeah, life just doesn't seem to be working. And it
Hmm.
elicits all kinds of stress and upset, and painful feelings. They're devastated. And maybe they distract themselves. They throw themselves into work if they've gone
Yeah.
through a breakup or divorce. They self-medicate with alcohol and other recreational
Hmm.
drugs. They go on pharmaceuticals because they haven't learned to work with their emotions. They can't cope with or manage the emotional repercussions of the traumas they've
Yeah.
experienced at different points in their lives. And so they medicate themselves. And
Hmm.
yet those that those emotions don't get processed, and those traumatic
Hmm.
wounds don't get healed because they're anesthetizing parts of themselves. And so, like, I'll teach people to work constructively with their emotions, and especially when I can work with people in person. It's transforming these. They're digesting the experiences, events, and the emotional backlog, and they're transforming these deeply wounded parts of themselves to build foundation. But what happens is when we take the steps to heal, we're also, and this is my daily practice too, whether it's the
Hmm.
meditation and at a much more intensive level when I go through the vision quest. Okay, as I said, we have this, every one of us, we have this inner core being,
Hmm.
and that gets obscured, it gets covered up. The more covered up it is, the more disconnected people are, the
Yeah.
more they have to seek out those external sources of validation
Hmm.
or seek out something that fills that empty void. But the more you can be present, you connect with this inner source. And as you take the steps to heal, not only that, it grows stronger, it grows more powerful in this core being. You become the embodiment of
Hmm.
your authentic internal core being. And and with that, there's a stronger connection to the higher power. So to
Yeah.
me, this is what it's about, deepening your connection to the core, becoming as embodied as you can possibly be. For me,
Hmm.
every day is like, how much more present can I be as I do my practice? Be be present with myself, feel what I'm holding in my body, whether it's emotions, if I feel constriction, tightness, stagnation, if I'm contracted anyway, open to
Hmm.
these areas. And as I work with them, there's this unfolding. And
Yeah.
again, it allows for this core being
Hmm.
to emerge more. And then when I go back to the mountain for the vision quest, then it's a big jump every time I
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you for elaborating on that. And from, what I take from that is there's a lot of trauma, and we want to be able to observe it, as you said, but also feel it without judgment. And
Hmm.
that's the goal here. We all go through different experiences, as you mentioned, and we all encounter difficulties throughout our lives. It doesn't always have to be the same for everyone. Everyone's experience is unique, but it's making sense of it, right? And to
Hmm.
your point, also, there's often shame that we experience based on whatever trauma we experience or whatever experience we had. We'll tend to judge it and have shame, and then we'll try to run away from that shame through the
Hmm.
various methods that you alluded to, whether it's alcohol or drugs, or seeking out external validation, whatever form that may take. But at the end
Hmm.
of the day, it's really sitting with it and having acceptance for it, because the more we resist, the more we cover that inner being up, and the more
Hmm.
pain we experience as a result of it, because all we truly want is a full expression of that inner being,
Hmm.
and embodiment of it, right? And that's what I take from what you've shared, but that's kind of been my own personal experience and realization, just as I've navigated this journey, as I like to look at it. And there's no one path to go through it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I so much appreciate the fact that, I mean, you're just reflecting back. Yeah, you're really hearing. You have that capacity to hear what I'm sharing, because
Mm-hmm.
there are many instances I work with people and I could feel like my words are going right by them. And
Mm-hmm.
yet I've worked with some of these same individuals, and especially when we're able to do the individual sessions. And there's a song by the band the Sex Pistols years ago called Pretty Vacant. And there's a way that we become very checked out. And
Mm-hmm.
I could see that in my own life. I'm not just pointing fingers, because
Yeah.
there are ways that I was very disconnected, oblivious, and we don't fully see what we're doing, how we're moving through the world, how we're acting out,
Yeah.
and we're just drawn into things that uh, do not necessarily nourish or sustain us, that are not healthy in any way. And but it was this deep and profound desire to to heal and grow and evolve. I was realizing how wounded I was years ago, and it's like, this is totally unacceptable. I cannot live like that. And but yeah, I very much appreciate the fact that, your own depth and insight and understanding that
Mm-hmm.
is being shared, that you're sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, again, I'm grateful just being able to talk to people like yourself and hear your experience, and others have been kind enough to share theirs, and
Mm,
you kind of see similar patterns emerge. And that's why I asked you, in your travels, like, at the end of the day, why are we all here? And that's kind of the goal for me to understand, and
mhm,
ask myself, and often reflect on my own mortality, and think about how much time I have. Not that I can determine that, but what can I do with it?
mhm,
Given the gift of every day, what can I do with it? How can I make the most of it? Whether it's through my own expression of myself as an individual, but also the people around me, and how me being me and embodying that full expression, how does that, hopefully, targeting that positive impact that I can have on others as well. So that's kind of how I look at that journey for myself. But
mhm.
Ben, thank you again for your time and willingness to share your personal experiences and some of the wisdom that not only you've accumulated, but what you've observed. I really appreciate that. And I think part of it is because of the distractions we experience in the world today, and they tend to accumulate from what I've been able to observe throughout history. It's hard for us to fully connect and be present, and not feel distracted. But I do appreciate everything you shared. For listeners that do want to learn more about your work, and what you're offering, what are some ways they can find that?
The best way to reach me is through my website, which is benoofana.com. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll spell it out, BEN and OOFANA. So BENOOFANA.com. Or I guess
Mm-hmm.
you could post that in the show notes.
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a Google Voice number you can reach out to me that I think Google's good about blocking spam calls, but that's 332-333-5155. You can look me up through Facebook Messenger, for instance. That's one way you can reach me. What else? There is on my website too, there's in the contact section, there's a contact form. And I work with people with such a wide range of issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to depend on what your needs are. I know I'm working with people with anything from, again, trained with the traditional Native American doctor and medicine man. So I'm working with people with heart disease and stroke, traumatic brain injuries, digestive
Mm-hmm.
disorders like colitis and Crohn's disease. So, yeah, you could find me through the website. But if someone's struggling with, in the midst of a breakup or divorce, patterns of abandonment, unrequited love, there is a free ebook, and that's just,
Mm-hmm.
you can go to gettingoveryourbreakup.com, or you could book a call through refiningrelationships.com, and that's relationships plural. So
Mm-hmm.
refiningrelationships.com, and you can search for me on Instagram, YouTube. So you could find me those ways.
No, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing all that. Any final thoughts, Ben? I know we covered quite a bit, but still give you that chance if we missed anything.
I would say that, because I was thinking about it just a few minutes ago, is to the best of your ability, strive to use every experience as a means to heal and grow and evolve. I can feel at times when I'm contracting in response to an event or experience or interaction. I could feel even things like eating certain foods are unhealthy habits, like spending too
Mm-hmm.
much time online. There's a lot of things we do that tend to constrict us or numb us or disconnect us. And so strive to develop that awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go forward into experience, incorporate, the practice that I showed you or that I demonstrated, where you acknowledge what's happening. What do you feel in your body? What are the feelings? Where are they situated? Breathe softly and deeply. As you work with this practice, that's going to help you to digest
Mm-hmm.
your lived experiences and your subsequent emotional responses. Make use of, in addition to doing practice, which I encourage you to do on a daily basis. If you don't do practice, you tend to stay stuck or stagnant. But also make use of the most powerful therapeutic interventions, which you'll need to determine according to your needs. Could be working with the gifted psychotherapist, doing deep tissue body work, working with an extraordinarily powerful healer. And
Yeah.
if you're really hardcore, maybe even go on the vision quest, but do your
Mm-hmm.
practice, do your intervention, and to the best of your ability, show up as fully present as you can every day.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you again for doing this.
Oh, you're very welcome. I very much enjoy the exchange with you.
Yeah.
Good for now.
Yep.